All right, so here is our first online lecture. I know this is not ideal, but we're all having to make some accommodations in a very extreme circumstance. So hopefully this will go as smoothly as possible. So this chapter is on the Great Depression. So we're picking up where we left off before we left for spring break and then for isolation. So we're on chapter 23. And again, this is the Great Depression. So follow along as best you can. So if you look at this picture and you think about where is the irony in this picture, and immediately your eye is drawn to this advertisement in the background with the phrase world's highest standard of living, and then here it says there's no way like the American way. And you have this happy smiling family, they all look well dressed, well fed, they're in a nice car, they've got a dog, clearly enjoying American life. And then what do you see in front of you? People waiting in line. This is a bread or a soup line. You can see the people are holding baskets and buckets and bags, hoping to get some food. And you can see also the racial divide. The family in the car is all white. People standing in front are minorities. To give you an idea of, again, the irony of living in the Great Depression. So when people think about the causes of the Great Depression, what you probably remember most is the stock market crash. And that's usually what people say caused the Great Depression. And that's true, it did. It did cause the Great Depression, but it's one of many causes, as we'll see. So stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. And we've seen this in recent days in response to the outbreak of the coronavirus. And that in and of itself was not enough to create this huge economic crises that was the Great Depression. So it's going to be the stock market crash with all these other things that we're going to talk about. But the stock market crash is important. So Wall Street at the time and still today was the financial capital of the world, the heart of which was the New York Stock Exchange. So throughout the 1920s, stock prices generally rose, and people could make a lot of money if they had the money to invest in the stock market, and they did. And generally speaking, the Republican Party, which was in power throughout most of the 1920s, had policies in place that would usher in a lot of this prosperity. As a matter of fact, average stock prices rose from January of 1921 to September of 1929 from an average of $110 to $455, to give you an idea of just how well the stock market did throughout the 1920s. But all that changed on what is known as Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, when there was a panic, selling of stocks, everybody trying to just dump their stocks. And it reached its peak on Thursday, October 29th, with a loss of 37% of value for most stocks in the stock market. Just a huge crash. And so people who had invested their money, who had stocks that they couldn't sell, now you're out of luck. And this, again, is huge and it's bad, but in and of itself does not cause the. So as it said, this appears to only hurt stockholders, which is not everybody. Just same as it is today, not everybody invests in the stock market. And so it didn't hurt everybody. Industry and agriculture were largely unhurt by the stock market crash. It was a severe blow to investors and banks. And what it did also do was it revealed and intensified many other weaknesses in the U.S. economy. So again, it's this perfect storm of circumstances with all these other things that are going to be revealed by the stock market crash. So we're going to get into some of those other causes here. So here's another cause of the Great Depression is overproduction and underconsumption. And we've talked about this actually before. If you remember all the way back to when we were talking about American Empire in that chapter, and we talked about the Spanish-American War, and we talked about Americans wanting to get involved in the Chinese markets because we had consumer goods that we were producing that people weren't buying, and that's obviously not good for the economy. It creates stagnation, so we were looking for new markets. That's continuing in the 1920s, and again, it gets exacerbated by the stock market crash. So our factories in America were producing about half the world's industrial goods, but the wealth in America was very unevenly distributed, and I put some facts here to kind of illuminate that. So per capita income, that means the income per person, generally rose about 10% for all Americans, but 75% for the wealthiest Americans. And looking more into some of these statistics, 60% of families earned less than the $2,000 that would be needed on average to cover necessities per month. So think about that for a second. 60% of families, that's over half of families in America, were earning less than the required $2,000 needed per month, about on average. So that 2,000 number is saying that that's about the amount of money you would need to cover basic necessities in America at that time. So that's pretty staggering. And on top of that, 80% of families have no savings, which would make sense. So if 60% of people aren't earning enough to make their basic necessities, then by default, that would mean a majority of people also don't have the money to put into savings, because you can't save what you don't have. So that's another huge problem in America. So going on more about overproduction and underconsumption. So we simultaneously have overproduction by businesses and underconsumption by consumers. So again, 60% of American families are not earning enough for basic necessities. So how could they be buying extras? They can't. But not responding to that, factories are still producing these goods that nobody's buying. And so as a result of that, store owners have to reduce their orders, and factories have to cut production and most significantly jobs. And that's going to hurt those people who, again, are probably already struggling with not enough income, and it's just going to spiral from there. Again, we're going back to the farmers. We always seem to mention the farmers as the people who have not been prospering really since the 1800s. They did not share in the prosperity of the 1920s. And this has been an ongoing problem for the farmers. This should be a review. We have new farming methods and new equipment which increase output, but remember supply and demand. If there's a surplus, that means low prices. And not only is there a surplus being created in America, but we also have new farming products coming in from Australia and Argentina. So preservation techniques are getting better, refrigeration is getting better, and so we can get food products from other countries. And that's also increasing the struggle for the farmers. So farmers can't pay back loans that they took out to buy the new equipment to try to keep up. There are a lot of bad debts, so loans were made to people who couldn't repay them, and when they can't repay them, that weakens the bank who loaned the money, and then the banks are forced to close, and that's going to create yet another problem. So leading into that, with a lot of the bad loans being made, a lot of banks are closing. So this is going to be another huge problem of these bank runs and panics. So this frantic reaction is going to show other failings as in before. Again, it's all going to spiral. Eventually, the Federal Reserve is going to actually raise interest rates. And this made borrowing money more expensive, right? The higher an interest rate it is, that means the more money you have to pay back over time. Banks began denying loans, meaning they weren't going to give out loans to new people, and calling in debts, meaning, hey, you have this outstanding debt, now you need to pay it. Borrowers are then going to start panicking, and they're going to rush to banks to withdraw their money, fearing that their bank is going to fail. And that's exactly what's going to happen. You can see this picture here that I've posted. All these people rushing to the bank to withdraw money. The banks don't actually keep all your money on hand. It's not like you put the money in the bank and it goes in some vault. I mean, it goes to pay other expenses and whatnot, and they keep a percentage of it on hand now. But if everybody comes and tries to withdraw all their money, that's going to be a problem. So by 1932, 2,300 banks collapse, and they take all the money they have with them. So if you were somebody who actually was able to have savings at this time, you're one of the few, one of the 20% who did. When the bank collapsed, it took all your money with you. Now that can't happen anymore. Now we have the FDIC, which is basically insurance on your money, so that if your bank, there were some sort of catastrophic event, and your bank were to collapse, that's basically saying the federal government is insuring your money up to a certain amount. So the FDIC was actually put in place because of the Great Depression. So if you're worried, you don't need to go take all your money and hide it under your mattress like a lot of people who lived in the Great Depression did. Fiscal policies are another cause of the Great Depression. There, as was shown before with some of those statistics, was a widening gap between the rich and the poor. There was also a standoff in international trade. So to try to help their own internal economies out, because the Great Depression is going to be worldwide, a lot of countries are going to impose heavy tariffs on other countries, meaning taxes on imported goods. And that's going to end up hurting everybody else in exchange. So this is going to be another product, but of the Great Depression. But again, this idea of easy credit throughout the 1920s, encouraging people to pay and buy for things that they didn't have the money for, encouraging people to buy items that they don't really need. All these things are going to increase the hardships of the Great Depression. Okay, so these are some more statistics to kind of give you an idea of just how bad things were. By 1932, just a few years into the Great Depression, investors had lost $74 billion in the stock market. That's a lot. Stocks lost 89% of their value. That's huge. 86,000 businesses had closed. 9,000 banks had closed, taking $9 million worth of savings with them. And unemployment went from 3.2% in 1929, which is amazing, by the way. That's a very small unemployment statistic, to 24.9% in 1932. So if you think about it, that's a quarter of the population. There's 1 in 4 people being out of a job, just a huge amount. So if you think back to our recent financial crisis in 2008, which was bad, not trying to say that it wasn't bad and it was no big deal, but unemployment was about 10% at the height of the Great Depression. So to compare that to 25%, that means more than double the amount of people out of work at our most recent financial crisis were out of work in the Great Depression. And the picture that I put on this slide is probably the most famous image from the Great Depression. It's called The Migrant Mother, and it's part of a series of photographs taken about this woman who had to move to California to try to find work. She was a widow, trying to find work on as a migrant worker on these different farms. I think she's on a pea farm at the time with her children. And if you just look at her face, and she looks so much older than she is. I want to say she was I know she was in her early 30s, and I want to say 32, which is the age I am now. And I look at her, and she looks at least 15 years older than me. At least that's what I hope. Maybe you think otherwise, but you could just see she obviously looks a lot older than 32 because of the stress and the toll that all of this has taken on her. Making things even worse for the farmers and everybody else by default is the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl is going on in the Great Plains region of the United States, and there'll be a map on here if you don't know the region I'm talking about. I'll show you in a second. So the natural landscape of the Great Plains is this buffalo grass. It's this really thick, deeply rooted grass that naturally grows on the Great Plains that had been farmed away. So the purpose of the buffalo grass and why it grows there is that it holds in moisture and it keeps the wind from blowing soil around, creating exactly what you see in this picture, a dust storm. So when farmers start moving into the Great Plains region in the 1800s and they start exposing the soil by farming it, that's going to cause a problem. So over time, there was a prolonged drought that just so happened to come up about this time. And again, without that buffalo grass in there to hold the moisture and to keep the soil down, the drought plus intense heat is going to lead to the Dust Bowl. So again, you can think about that picture that was on the previous slide. What would happen is anytime there'd be any kind of wind or extreme weather, it would kick up all this dust from, again, an overexhausted soil that had been over-farmed, poor farming techniques, and the loss of that natural buffalo grass. And it would kick up all this dust. And again, think about the picture that was on the slide before it, and maybe flip back if you want to. And it would kick up huge clouds of dust. And it would darken the sky. It would cover homes. I mean, if you were living in this area at the time, there would just be dust everywhere in your house. You couldn't keep up with it. It would get in food. It would cause all sorts of problems with people's health. People were eating it. It was wearing down their teeth. It was getting in their lungs. I mean, just tons and tons of problem. Agriculture, as you can imagine, is going to pretty much stop in this region. So we're talking about like Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, the eastern part of Colorado. That's the region that we're talking about that was affected. 35,000 people had to leave their farms because they can't farm anymore. Even if they have livestock, what's the livestock going to graze on? And they had to head west. They were typically called Okies, even though obviously they're not all from Oklahoma. And they head west on Route 66 to work in California, which was not affected by the Dust Bowl. So these people who very proudly had their own farms in this region are forced to give them up and to go west to go work on someone else's farm as migrant laborers because that's the only option open to them. So people in the Great Plains are forced to leave their homes. People elsewhere are forced to leave their homes as well. Homelessness becomes a huge problem. So the term Hooverville is the sarcastic term that was given to these shanty towns. Of course, people blaming the president who was in office when this all started. That was Herbert Hoover. So they ironically caused these shanty towns, as you can see in the picture here, Hoovervilles. And so these were people who were one out of four people who were out of jobs, or even maybe people who had jobs but were severely underemployed, who had lost everything, couldn't afford rent, forced to live in these shacks, basically built out of whatever they could find. Having to stand in bread lines, selling apples on the corners, just trying to get by as best they can with no kind of income and no place to go. So again, Hoover is the man who is in charge when the stock market crashes. So FDR is probably most famous for being the president during the Great Depression. He is not president when it starts. Herbert Hoover, is our president in 1929 when it starts. He did not anticipate the crash. Most people did not. Most people viewed the economy as being pretty fundamentally sound. And the problem he felt was that there needed to be more confidence. And so in order to increase confidence, he put in place the largest tariff in American history called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And remember, taxes are, in essence, a tax on imported goods. So the point being to help Americans buy American, and that this would hopefully help American industries. And unfortunately, and we briefly talked about this before, Europeans are just going to retaliate and put high taxes on American goods, and it's really not going to make anything better. In fact, it makes everything worse. So again, he felt that we just need to get our confidence back. We need to get people back out there buying and selling goods, stimulating the economy, etc. So if the problem is confidence and our economy is fundamentally sound, he felt that the solution lay with the business community. So he called to the White House these leaders in the business community and discussed different ways in which they could maintain wages, jobs, and production. He rejected any calls for any kind of federal programs to give aid to people or to employ workers, because he felt that this went against this idea of American rugged individualism. In his mind, we really just have to wait out this storm, and eventually the economy will right itself. Government doesn't really need to intervene. They don't need to spend any extra money. Things are just going to get better eventually. So some things that he did do, which angered a lot of people, is that he gave a lot of loans to banks and businesses. In fact, $1.7 billion went to banks and businesses to help limit bankruptcy. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. These are things that are being tossed around now to try to help different businesses and industries out who are suffering as a result of the coronavirus. So it's not an unheard of thing. But the problem that a lot of people had with it is that all this money is going to businesses and not necessarily straight to the people. And of course, the argument is that there's a trickle-down effect, right? If businesses are able to stay open, then they can employ people, and people can get the things that they need. I mean, we're not talking just billion-dollar industries. These would have been small businesses as well. But again, it just did not sit well with a lot of people, and they nicknamed them the billion-dollar soup kitchens. So again, the idea is he's not looking out for the average person, that he's only looking out for people who are already wealthy, which again is not entirely true. Think about that idea of these aren't all big businesses that are being helped. There's a trickle-down effect, etc. But that's the effect that, that's the impression that people. On top of it all, we have the bonus army, which is really just going to increase the negative opinion and the negative view that people have against Hoover. So the bonus army. In 1924, Congress promised to give a bonus, meaning additional money, to World War I veterans. And they were supposed to get this later on in 1945. So veterans demanded that since the economy was doing so poorly, they should get their payment now and not have to wait until 1945, now being 1932, really the height of the Great Depression. And in order to try to demand this, in the spring of 1932, 20,000 unemployed and underemployed veterans marched to Washington, D.C. to try to pressure the government to give them their bonuses early. And Hoover opposed this. It would be about $2.5 billion, and he argued that $2.5 billion additional dollars would make it impossible for them to pass a balanced budget. Like, look, we just don't have the money. We can't give you money we don't have. So again, that's a fair argument too, but on the other hand, doesn't look so good to the average people, especially when, bailouts are being given to industries. It just doesn't come off well. And so the Senate defeated the bill that would allow the veterans to have their money. Some went home, but some decided to stay in Washington, D.C. And this is where things really started to get bad. Hoover labeled these men who were staying in D.C. insurrectionists and ordered them to leave. Insurrectionists being like people who are trying to cause like public harm, like they're trying to, stir up trouble. Some people did, but then that 1,000 people refused to leave, even though they were ordered to leave by the federal government. And so the president sent in General Douglas MacArthur, who we're going to learn more about shortly when we learn about World War II, led 700 soldiers to forcibly evict the people who were staying there. And these weren't just the veterans themselves, but their wives and their children. So they were, throwing tear gas. They were using clubs to beat up these veterans. And newsreels at the time, yes, they did have cameras, were able to capture what was going on. And people saw images of it and heard about it. And the significance of this incident with the Bonus Army is that it shows Hoover's insensitivity and his unwillingness to address these widespread issues. Americans felt like we're on our own. This is the worst economic disaster in modern times, and there's no one here to help us. Which leads to our first chapter question: to what extent was Hoover and the federal government responsible for the Great Depression? If you want to choose this one, be careful. I've had several people get, confused by the question, and they're writing about Hoover, but they're actually meaning FDR, and they're arguing, well, it's not his fault because he wasn't president when it started, and I think they're meaning FDR and not Hoover. So just make sure, word to the wise, when you're answering a question, you read it carefully and you understand what exactly it's asking. All right, so the election of 1932, the Democrats are going to nominate, again, the person who is most famous for the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is a really popular, reform-minded, at the time, governor of New York. He very famously was unable to walk because he contracted polio. So I guess, fittingly, we're dealing with a pandemic right now. Polio used to come around every year. If you have grandparents or great-grandparents who are in their 80s or 90s, you can probably ask them about polio, and they can tell you just it would be like what's going on right now, but even worse, because if you caught polio, and even if you didn't die from polio, like FDR, you would usually be affected in some way. Maybe you were unable to walk, or any other number of different disabilities, because what it does is it attacks your muscles. So it's not like FDR was paralyzed in that he had a spinal injury. He was paralyzed in that the polio had so affected his leg muscles that he was unable to walk. So again, it's interesting if you do have somebody in your family who remembers the time before we had the polio vaccine, it'd be interesting to talk to them about it and to compare it to what's going on today. Because it used to come around in the summer a lot. I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't tell you why so much in the summer, but probably because people were out more and mingling amongst one another, and people lived in fear of this year after year after year. But there's a vaccine, and you probably have your polio vaccine, so you don't need to worry about it. Not only was he very popular, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was also very popular. So because FDR, again, did not have the use of his legs, he didn't want to make that public. People knew that when he came down with polio years before this, people knew that he had that, and maybe he had a vague sense that he was in some way disabled by it, but he didn't want people to know the extent of it. This is a different time. People were not as accepting as people with disabilities as they are now, and he feared that were people to know the extent of his disability, they would judge him as weak and not capable of leading the nation. Obviously not true. That's not a sentiment that people really have nowadays, but again, we're talking 1932. This is a while ago. But because he was trying to hide his disability from people and, being very careful about when he made public appearances and whatnot, often Eleanor Roosevelt would go out and do a lot of different public appearances to aid in her husband. Fun fact, Eleanor Roosevelt never had to change her last name. So Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR were actually, I believe it was second cousins, some sort of cousin. Eleanor Roosevelt was actually the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, and FDR was a Roosevelt from like the other side of the family. So she was always a Roosevelt, and she never had to change her name when they got married. So fun fact there. So again, Eleanor Roosevelt is Teddy Roosevelt's niece. Her father was a pretty severe alcoholic and died young, as did her mother. She had a very lonely and sad childhood. She had to live with an elderly grandmother. And even before that, her mother was a noted beauty. Like she was, famously beautiful. Eleanor Roosevelt's not, known for many other achievements, but not her looks. And her mother often teased her for her looks. Her grandmother did. Her mother-in-law did. So she just always was, picked on by the people around her. And that made her very sympathetic to other people's needs. And so it made her a very unique and important first lady at the time. So in 1932, when FDR pretty soundly defeats Herbert Hoover, who again a lot of people blamed for the Great Depression, he vaguely promised this New Deal, that he was going to do this New Deal and it was going to help America. And again, it's pretty vague, so people didn't really know, okay, well, what is he going to do? But that was fine by them. He won with 57% of the popular vote, and people were confident that he could help them out of this current situation. So this is what he had to say. I pledge to you, I pledge to myself, a new deal for the American people. Again, what exactly does that mean? We don't know, but people were confident that he was going to be a more active president. So FDR was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. Inaugurations were a lot later then than they are now. Because people couldn't travel as quickly as they can now. And if you look at this picture that I put on this slide, you can see again, remember that FDR was very keen to hide his disability. So whenever you see him pictured and he's standing, he's always standing next to something that he can hold on to. And there's usually something that's going to hide his legs, as you can see is the case in this picture here. So he immediately organizes this group that gets the nickname the Brain Trust. And they are just basically his advisors. They're called the Brain Trust because they're smart people. And they start immediately with a series of different trial and error goals. So this is like a working situation. It's kind of similar to the situation we have now. Like this is unprecedented. We don't really know what exactly we should do. We know we want to take some action, but we don't know what the right course of action is. And so it's going to be trial and error. Let's see what works. Let's see what doesn't. So their large overarching goals are going to be, number one, to restore public confidence and achieve immediate relief for people. 2, promote industrial and agricultural recovery. And 3, put in place long-term reform for businesses. So these are all pretty tall orders. So think relief, recovery, reform. Immediate relief, recovery for the economy, and then reform for the long term. So the 100 days refers to, very easily, FDR's first 100 days in office, in which he does a lot of stuff. First and foremost, he has the Emergency Banking Act. On March 5th, he begins a 4-day bank holiday. All the banks are going to close down for 4 days. They're going to be investigated. And those that are deemed to be stable are going to be allowed to reopen, and people are going to be able to put their money back in these banks. Next thing that he does is he starts a series of these fireside chats. Famous thing that he did. Again, if you know anybody who is who can remember the 1930s, old enough to remember them, again, these are people probably in their late 80s and 90s, they probably remember the fireside chats. My grandma, who would have been 92 this year, remembered them like very strongly. She had clear memories of these fireside chats. So what he would do is he would come on the radio, because they didn't have TVs back then. He would come on the radio and he would give these informal personal messages in which he would explain different New Deal programs. So the first one concerned banking, and he urged Americans to put their money back in banks. And people like this. It's called the fireside chat because people felt like he was in their home, sitting next to the fireplace, like talking one-on-one with him. No other president had done something like this and really changed the way that presidents try to use the media to their advantage. And again, if you know somebody who was alive at this time, they probably have some pretty clear memories of these. And he also saw through Congress the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which was basically deposit insurance for your money. So again, you don't have to worry about your bank collapsing and losing all your money. So remember, another goal was to get relief immediately to Americans who are suffering. And one of the ways in which they went about doing that is to put people to work. So employing them through the federal government. Like, okay, if there's not enough businesses, private businesses to employ people, the government's going to employ people. They're going to pay people to go out and do work. One of the more popular ones was the Civilian Conservation Corps. This program was specifically aimed at young men between the ages of 18 and 25. And it was like a corps in the Army. You would enlist and you would go and do these different tours of duty. You would work in the different national parks doing all different kinds of work, whatever was required of you, and you would be paid for it. So again, the idea behind this is get people to work, get money in their pockets, get them to spend that money, and then once they are spending that money, they can go out and they can help stimulate the economy from there. Another one would be the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. This was a series of dams and hydroelectric plants that were made in the Tennessee Valley area. And this provided inexpensive electricity to a lot of people who lived in this. This is a very, very depressed region. Even before the Great Depression, it was just economically depressed. And so it allowed people to have electricity in their homes. A lot of people didn't have any electricity. Again, it's hard to believe we're in the 1930s and people still didn't have electricity, but that's the case. They couldn't afford it. And it's still around. It still actually provides very low-cost electricity to people. And it also helped prevent flooding in this region, which helped out the agriculture of it as well. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided cash to state agencies who were in charge of aiding the poor. And again, if you think about, there's still state agencies around today that do a lot of work for people who are in foster care. Then they maybe had orphanages and running soup kitchens, just any kind of relief that is provided by the state. This would provide federal funds for those agencies. All right, so there are actually, historians have looked back in time and defined like two phases of the New Deal, if you will. Obviously, this isn't something that Roosevelt intended. This is something that we've done artificially, looking back and saying, well, this part of the New Deal kind of goes together and this part doesn't. So the goal of the first New Deal, as we'll call it, was to see through two major efforts to stabilize and coordinate the economy. So the two big ones are the Agricultural Adjustment Act is the first. So that, again, is going to be aimed primarily, obviously, at agriculture and to try to help out the farmers who, again, have been just not doing well for a long, long time. And so the goal of that was to raise prices for food products by offering money to farmers to voluntarily limit their farm production. Remember, the main problem is overproduction because there's more of the food items on the market that lowers the prices, supply and demand. So the idea is to give people money to hold back some of their supplies so that that's not a case anymore. Because if you're a farmer, you're not going to voluntarily hold back some of your crops, because if everybody doesn't do it, that's not going to make a difference. It's only going to hurt you. But if you're getting paid to actually not sell part of your crop and to hold it back in storage, and everybody is being paid to do that, then slowly over time, they can reduce the supply and increase the prices. And this is going to, of course, help out farmers. Second big one is the National Industrial Recovery Act. And in this case, the government suspended antitrust laws, allowing businesses to write codes that coordinated prices, regulate production levels, and establish conditions of employment. So What is the result of the first 100 days, Roosevelt's first 100 days in office? Well, it does stabilize the economy. It does have a robust but imperfect recovery. We're not going to officially pull out of the Great Depression until we enter World War II. And our entrance into World War II, I mean, the demand needed for war goods effectively pulls us out of the Great Depression. So, if we hadn't got pulled into World War II, would we have recovered on our own? It's hard to say, and you can talk to different historians that specialize in the economy, and they might have different opinions. But it did help. Our GDP did climb, but unemployment still remained pretty stubbornly high in America. And not everybody agreed with what the government was doing. Big shocker there. It was very unprecedented, the actions that Roosevelt was taking, but still really on the conservative side. Everything that he did was well within his presidential authority, and he passed through Congress. Most of the things that we're talking about were not executive orders. They went through Congress. And there was no state-run economy at any point during the Great Depression. And this is actually what ended up happening in many different European countries because, again, this was a worldwide Great Depression. Other countries were affected by it. And in other countries, the solution that they turned to was to, have the government take control of the economy. And we didn't resort to that. So it's not as far-reaching as some might assume, and because of that, some people criticized it for being not far-reaching enough, and some people criticized it for being an overreach. So let's talk about some people that opposed it. First and foremost, you're going to have Father Charles Coughlin. He was a Michigan priest and radio host who wanted to nationalize the bank and coinage of silver. So somebody who was looking for more government involvement. The second person that we're talking about here, Dr. Francis E. Townsend, was a California physician who wanted all people over the age of 60 to get $200, a guaranteed salary of $200 per month. And that became Social Security. So that is actually something that was adopted by the government, and it's still around today. Huey Long is an interesting figure. He was a politician from Louisiana, and he proposed this Share Our Wealth campaign. And he actually planned a presidential run, but he was actually assassinated before he could really get that going very well. And his idea was to take money from the rich and give the needy a guaranteed $5,000. And this is something that comes up a lot in a lot of different politicians today, trying to, do some sort of like guaranteed income. So some of these ideas, maybe they weren't adopted at the time. Some were, Social Security was. But a lot of these ideas did not die out with the Okay, so again, we historians have categorized the Great Depression into two separate phases. We have the first New Deal and you have the second New Deal. Second New Deal is from about 1934 to 1936. So Roosevelt knew that people were critical of him, and he responded. And the second New Deal is more radical and more aggressive than the first New Deal. So here's some of the things that he did. The Public Works Administration employed people to do different public projects like building bridges, painting murals, different things like this. Something that the government actually did that's really helpful to us historians nowadays is they paid people to go and interview the surviving members of society who were born into slavery. And so we actually have a series of interviews that, again, we historians have that were done at the time, and they were paid for by the federal government. There were people still alive in the 1930s who remembered being born into slavery. They were young at the time, but still had memories of it. And so now we have a very valuable source of information because of that. And also the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was put in place to help regulate the stock market. So remember, relief, recovery, reform. We not only want to recover now, the last part is going to be long-term reform, so that, again, something like this is never going to happen in America, at least to this extent. The Second New Deal, some other things that were passed during the Second New Deal, Social Security Act, which again is probably the most far-reaching of the of the act's passed is still around today, and it's payments for retirees who are over 65. The Wagner Labor Relations Act put federal legal protections in place for unions. Remember that union membership generally declined throughout the 1920s. This helped to strengthen labor unions. And the Fair Labor Standards Act put in place the first modern minimum wage, which is still something that's debated today. What should minimum wage be? Should it be raised? Should it not be raised? This is an ongoing issue. But the fact that we have a minimum wage, we can credit to the New Deal. So again, not everybody was a fan of Roosevelt and what he was doing. Some people felt that he was overreaching his authority as president. And so as a result, in the summer of 1935, the Supreme Court started overturning different New Deal programs, which was a huge blow to Roosevelt. The NIRA was, for instance, unanimously struck down. This gave the federal government powers of economic regulation that were not justified in the Commerce Clause, and because of that, they felt was an overreach of federal powers. They also invalidated the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which, if you remember back to the first New Deal, was one of the big two that he passed, and it got overturned by the Supreme Court. So naturally, Roosevelt and so he tries to push through Congress a court reform bill that would allow the president to nominate an additional 6 justices. So obviously his goal there is to try to get Supreme Court justices who are going to support him and are going to make sure that they're not going to overturn the things that he passes. So it's pretty obvious what he's trying to do there. In fact, he had a Democratic majority in Congress, but they still refused to pass this court reform bill because they felt that it blurred the line between the judicial and executive branches, which it pretty obviously does. And conservatives who were in office were pretty angered by this overreach. And as a result, it made it more difficult for Roosevelt to get any additional New Deal programs passed. But surprisingly, after this, the New Deal does become more New Deal friendly. Make of that what. So that leads to our next chapter question. Did FDR overstep his authority in implementing the New Deal, or was it a necessary action in a time of crisis? So let's look at the different impacts of the New Deal, starting with the economy. Unemployment does fall, but it only falls to 14%. So it's still very high. Again, you think about the Great Recession when a lot of people were out of work starting in 2008. The height of that was 10%. So the unemployment, it does fall from about 25% to 14%, but it's still high. Industrial output does return to pre-crash levels. And when things start getting better, FDR tries to cut back some of these New Deal programs. So the purpose of the New Deal was not to leave all these programs in place, but to put them in place as like a temporary measure. Like, we'll get people back, to work, get people paid, give out all these emergency loans, and then slowly start drawing back as the economy recovers. And when he tries to do that, it causes another recession. And so what this proves is that it doesn't bring about a full economic recovery. And officially, the Great Depression is only going to end with our entrance into World War II. Some political impacts. It does accelerate the progressive era expansion of the federal government. The federal government from this point on is going to take responsibility for the collective welfare of the American people. So that social safety net that we've mentioned many, many, many times as not being in place is now going to be in place. So a lot of the things that we know are there for people in need now were put in place because of the Great Depression. If they weren't put in place at that time, it started that shift towards it in an important way. It does expand the federal bureaucracy through new agencies so that the federal bureaucracy is actually the largest single employer in America today. Some social impacts. In terms of African Americans, it does not directly confront racism in any way, but what it does do is it changes the black vote to be largely Democratic. And so we have this what's called New Deal coalition of people who shift to being pretty staunchly Democratic, unions, minorities, and white Southerners, who primarily before this had been Republicans. Remember, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And this does happen a lot, where you see people becoming loyal to a political party when there's a really strong president in power. So a lot of people who, for instance, grew up during the Great Depression became Democrats because of FDR. And a lot of people who grew up in the 1980s during Reagan's administration became Republicans because of Reagan. This is a phenomenon that we see happening throughout history. And in terms of women, it didn't directly challenge gender inequality. We are going to have our first female member of the president's cabinet. Frances Perkins is going to be the Secretary of Labor. But again, in terms of pushing any kind of like legislation through, you're not going to find a whole lot of that. But Eleanor Roosevelt herself did promote equal treatment of women and minorities through a lot of different various actions. She's a really important figure. You could teach we could have a whole lecture on her and just on her own and what she did, but that is going to be something that she took on. But again, the New Deal itself didn't directly address those issues.